The mahogany dining table was set for two, the scent of roasted garlic lingering in the quiet Seattle suburb, painting the picture of a perfect marriage. But next to Carmen's untouched wine glass sat a folded piece of heavy stock paper bearing Raphael's familiar handwriting, a goodbye note she wasn't supposed to find until he was miles above the clouds. Yet as the front door handle slowly turned to hours before his scheduled flight, the true terror of the night began to unfold. There are shadows lurking behind every perfect suburban facade. If you are drawn to the beautiful, dangerous fragments of broken vows, stay with me as we uncover them. The pen felt unusually heavy in Raphael's hand. He sat at the quartz island of their kitchen, the only light coming from the low-hanging pendant lamp overhead. Outside, the Seattle rain drummed a relentless rhythmic beat against the bay window, matching the hollow thudding in his chest. For 3 months, he had been a ghost in his own marriage, quietly collecting the pieces of a puzzle he had prayed would never fit together. But they did, the hotel charges on a separate credit card. The lingering scent of an expensive cedarwood cologne that Raphael certainly couldn't afford on a logistics manager's salary. The name Tyler Black whispered in the dark when she thought he was asleep. Raphael neatly folded the heavy cream paper. He didn't yell in the letter. He didn't hurl insults. He merely stated the facts, laying out the timeline of her betrayal with the precise clinical coldness of an autopsy report. I know about the evenings at the Fairmont. I know about Tyler. Please do not call my mother. My lawyer will contact you by Friday. He placed the envelope perfectly in the center of the island, right next to the bowl of organic lemons she had brought home from work. He grabbed his duffel bag, the nylon strap biting into his shoulder, and walked out into the downpour. The Uber was already waiting, headlights cutting through the damp suburban gloom. He didn't look back. Across town, the fluorescent lights of Greenleaf Market hummed with the chaotic energy of the evening rush. Carmen Delgado untied her green linen apron, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked her phone. 3 unread messages, all from Tyler. Missed you in the wine aisle today. Room 412 tomorrow? Answer me, beautiful. She quickly swiped the notifications away, a flush of guilt and adrenaline warming her neck. She caught her reflection in the glass of the floral refrigerator. Dark hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, a woman who looked entirely put together while actively dismantling her life. Rachel Green, her shift supervisor, bumped her shoulder lightly as she passed by with a crate of expired hydrangeas. You look miles away, Carmen, Rachel said, her sharp eyes lingering a second too long on the phone clutched in Carmen's hand. Everything okay with Raph? Perfect. Carmen lied smoothly, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. He's just working late. Again. Right, Rachel murmured, her tone neutral but heavy with unspoken understanding. Rachel had seen Tyler's black Porsche parked in the delivery bay twice this week. Rachel knew. Everyone in the upper management circle probably knew. By the time Carmen pulled her sedan into their driveway, the rain had intensified into a blinding sheet of water. The house was completely dark. No porch light, no television glow from the living room, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. She unlocked the door, shaking the water from her umbrella, the silence of the hallway pressing against her ears. Raph, she called out. Nothing. She dropped her keys on the console table and walked into the kitchen, flipping on the switch. The light hit the cream envelope immediately. Her name, written in Raphael's sharp architectural handwriting, seemed to scream at her from the countertop. Her breath hitched. A cold dread, primal and sharp, coiled in her stomach. With shaking fingers, she tore the seal and began to read. I know about the evenings at the Fairmont. The paper slipped from her hand, fluttering to the hardwood floor. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He was gone. He knew everything, and he was gone. She stood frozen, staring at the empty space where her husband was supposed to be, the reality of her ruined life crashing down on her all at once. Then over the sound of the driving rain outside, she heard it. The unmistakable click of a key sliding into the front door's deadbolt, the heavy brass knob turning, the door creaking open, letting the cold storm wind into the foyer. Raphael hadn't left. The heavy oak door shut with a dull, final thud, cutting off the howl of the wind, but sealing the storm inside. Raphael stood in the entryway, the dim light from the kitchen casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. He was drenched. Water dripped from the hem of his dark wool coat, pooling on the expensive Persian runner Carmen had spent weeks selecting. His duffel bag slipped from his shoulder, hitting the ground with a heavy, wet sound that made Carmen flinch. He had not wanted this. He had planned a clean amputation, a surgical removal of himself from her life, executing it with the precision his career demanded. But the Pacific Gale had turned Interstate 5 into a flooded parking lot and SeaTac Airport into a chaotic cavern of stranded passengers staring at a wall of red blinking, canceled statuses. The universe, in a cruel twist of irony, had forced him back to the very epicenter of his humiliation. Rafael walked slowly toward the kitchen, his wet leather shoes squeaking softly against the floorboards. He stopped at the edge of the island. He did not look at her face. Instead, his gaze fell directly to the floor where the cream-colored envelope and the heavy stock paper lay face down near the toe of Carmen's designer boots. Carmen could not breathe. Her lungs felt like they had been wrapped in iron. She wanted to speak, to offer some reflexive apology or a desperate lie, but the sheer coldness radiating from her husband paralyzed her. This was not the Rafael who patiently listened to her complain about inventory shortages, nor the man who warmed her car in the winter. The man standing before her was a stranger, stripped of his warmth, his eyes hollow and unreadable. "The crosswinds," Rafael said softly. His voice was completely flat, devoid of anger or sorrow. It was the tone of a man reporting a minor logistical error. "They grounded all flights past 8 o'clock. He slowly unbuttoned his soaked coat. The mundane action felt excruciatingly loud in the quiet kitchen. He draped the heavy garment over the back of a dining chair, indifferent to the water soaking into the upholstery. "Raph," Carmen finally managed to whisper. Her voice trembled, sounding small and pathetic even to her own ears. Rafael raised a hand just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to silence her instantly. He stepped forward, bending down with a deliberate slowness that made Carmen's heart hammer wildly against her ribs. He picked up the letter from the floor. He brushed a speck of dust from the thick paper, folded it neatly along its original crease, and placed it back in the center of the quartz island, exactly where he had left it an hour ago. "I am going to take a shower," he announced, staring blankly at the bowl of organic lemons. "Then I am going to sleep into the guest room. We are not going to talk about this tonight, Carmen. If you try to speak to me before tomorrow morning, I will walk out into that storm and sleep in the terminal." He turned and walked toward the hallway leading to the stairs. He did not ask if she was sorry. He did not ask how long it had been going on. He simply ascended the steps, the sound of his wet shoes slowly fading into the upper level of the house. Carmen remained rooted to the kitchen floor, the low hum of the refrigerator, the only sound accompanying the steady drumming of the rain. She stared at the letter on the counter, the realization washing over her like ice water. The secret was out, but the punishment was not an explosion. It was this suffocating, terrifying silence, and they were locked in it together. The sound of the water running in the upstairs bathroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on the house. Carmen sat on the edge of their king-size bed in the master suite, staring at the digital clock on the nightstand. 11:42 p.m. The glowing red numbers blurred as silent tears finally spilled over her lashes, tracing hot, miserable paths down her pale cheeks. For 7 years, the sound of Rafael's late-night shower had been a comforting, white noise, a steady signal that the day's corporate battles were over and the sanctuary of their home remained intact. Now it was the soundtrack to her impending ruin. She listened to the old pipes groaning within the walls, picturing him under the scalding spray, washing away the freezing rain, and perhaps every lingering trace of affection he had ever held for her. When the water finally shut off, the sudden absence of noise was deafening. Carmen instinctively held her breath. She heard the faint squeak of the bathroom door opening, then the soft, muffled thud of his footsteps on the hallway carpet. He didn't pause outside their bedroom door. He didn't hesitate. The footsteps continued straight down the hall, ending with the solid, unmistakable click of the guest room door latching shut. Then the lock turned, a tiny metallic sound that echoed like a gavel striking wood in the quiet house. He had locked her out, not just from the room, but from the narrative of their own destruction. Carmen stood up, her legs trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the mattress to steady herself. She walked out into the dimly lit hallway. The storm outside continued its violent assault against the siding, the wind rattling the window panes, but inside the air was stagnant and thick. She crept toward the guest room, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. She stopped just inches from the closed door. Pressing her hand flat against the painted wood, she strained to hear anything, a heavy sigh, the rustle of sheets, the sound of him breaking down. Nothing. Absolute terrifying silence. Her mind raced, spinning through a carousel of catastrophic scenarios. What was he doing in the dark? Was he calculating his financial assets? Was he drafting an email to her strict Catholic mother in Portland, detailing exactly what kind of daughter she had raised? Or worse, was he simply lying there staring at the ceiling, completely hollowed out by her actions? She almost wished he had thrown something. A shattered vase, a punched wall, a screaming match in the kitchen. Those were human reactions. Those were things she could navigate. She could cry, she could beg, she could play the desperately remorseful wife and try to salvage the wreckage. But Rafael had given her absolutely nothing to react to. He had meticulously weaponized his silence, turning his mere physical presence into an instrument of psychological torture. The man she had promised her life to was currently breathing on the other side of a thin wooden door, yet he felt as dangerous and unreachable as the bottom of the ocean. She sank slowly to the floor, her back sliding down the wall opposite his room, pulling her knees tight against her chest. The cold from the hardwood seeped deep into her bones. If she knocked, if she defied his single boundary, and forced a conversation, she knew he would follow through on his threat to walk out into the freezing storm. She was trapped in a purgatory entirely of her own making, paralyzed by the chilling realization that Rafael wasn't just planning to divorce her. He was going to watch her slowly unravel first. Curled against the cold hallway wall, the silence of the house pressed so heavily against Carmen that her mind instinctively sought refuge in the past, retreating to the brightly lit aisles of Greenleaf Market, where the ruin had truly begun. It had not started in a shadowed hotel room. It had started 6 months ago with the subtle, intoxicating shift in the air whenever Tyler Black walked into the floral department. As the regional director, Tyler was a man constructed of sharp angles, tailored Italian wool, and the kind of casual arrogance that only old money and corporate authority could buy. His visits to the Seattle branch were supposed to be strictly operational, but by early autumn, his inspection route inevitably ended near the imported orchids Carmen so meticulously arranged. She remembered the exact moment the invisible boundary had been breached. It was a late Tuesday afternoon, the air smelling faintly of damp soil and crushed eucalyptus. Carmen was trimming the thick stems of white calla lilies when Tyler appeared beside her, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his dark cashmere coat. He didn't look at the flowers. His gaze was fixed entirely on the delicate pulsing vein at the side of her neck. "You have a remarkable eye for composition, Carmen." He had murmured, his voice a low, resonant hum that cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the busy store. He reached out his fingertips, grazing the sensitive skin of her inner wrist as he ostensibly examined a heavy blossom. The touch was fleeting, lasting barely a second, yet it left a searing electric imprint. She had pulled her hand back, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, but she had not looked away from his eyes. That had been her first fatal failure. Rachel Green had seen it all. Standing 2 aisles over, pretending to organize a display of artisanal dark chocolates, Rachel possessed a sharp, almost predatory instinct for human frailty. She never confronted Carmen directly, but her quiet observations manifested in small, suffocating ways. A slow, knowing raise of an eyebrow when Tyler's black Porsche lingered unnecessarily in the loading zone. A softly exhaled sigh when Carmen returned from the back inventory room with flushed cheeks and hastily reapplied lipstick. Rachel became the silent, oppressive mirror, reflecting Carmen's descent, a constant reminder of the steady, secure life she was risking for a man who viewed her as a beautiful, tragic distraction. The affair had blossomed in the quiet, empty spaces of her marriage. Rafael was a fundamentally good man, steadfast and reliable, but his love was practical, expressed in paid utility bills and repaired windshield wipers. Tyler offered a toxic, thrilling validation. He noticed the expensive, illicit perfume she began wearing. He noticed the way her silk blouses draped over her collarbones, the secret text messages vibrating against her thigh during mundane staff meetings felt like a dangerous narcotic she could not stop consuming. "Just one drink," Tyler had whispered weeks later, by the refrigerated wine coolers, the chill of the glass biting into Carmen's spine as he cornered her in a blind spot away from the security cameras. His eyes had darkened, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. "A harmless hour, Carmen. Tell your husband they need you for inventory." She had sent the lie to Rafael without a second thought. Working late. Leave some dinner for me. Now sitting alone in the dark, drafty hallway of her shattered home, the memory of that initial thrill tasted like battery acid in the back of her throat. The elegant, cinematic romance she had constructed in her mind was exposed as a cheap, ugly betrayal, entirely dismantled by the sheer devastating reality of Rafael sleeping just inches away from her, locked behind a wooden door. She pressed her face hard into her knees, the intoxicating scent of eucalyptus, long replaced by the sterile, dusty smell of the carpet, finally understanding the catastrophic cost of a harmless hour. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the biting cold of the hardwood floor finally drove Carmen from her miserable vigil in the upstairs hallway. Her muscles ached stiff and shivering as she slowly descended the staircase, guided only by the intermittent, strobing flashes of lightning filtering through the foyer windows. She needed water. She needed a moment to breathe where the air didn't feel entirely consumed by her husband's proximity. But as her foot touched the bottom step, she froze. A harsh rhythmic vibration was tearing through the silence of the ground floor. It was a mechanical, urgent buzzing against the hard surface of the quartz kitchen island. Carmen pressed herself against the wall, peering around the archway. The kitchen was pitch black, save for a small, glaring rectangle of blue light illuminating the center of the counter. Her smartphone, and sitting directly across from it, perfectly still on a leather bar stool, was Rafael. He hadn't stayed in the guest room. He had come back downstairs, sitting in the dark like a ghost haunting his own life. He didn't reach for the phone. He didn't attempt to unlock it or flip it face down. He simply sat with his hands resting loosely on his thighs, watching the screen illuminate the darkness with a detached, chilling fascination. Buzz, buzz. The screen lit up again, casting a sickly pale glow across Rafael's exhausted features. From her vantage point in the shadows, Carmen couldn't read the text, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly who it was. Teller was a man accustomed to instant gratification. He possessed the arrogant impatience of someone who believed the world and everyone in it operated on his schedule. When Carmen hadn't replied to his earlier messages, his ego would have perceived it not as a crisis but as a challenge. The unread texts were likely escalating from smooth persuasion to irritated demands. "Where are you? Why are you ignoring me?" "Pick up the phone, Carmen." Every vibration sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through Carmen's stomach. The sound was deafening. It was the vulgar, undeniable intrusion of her lover into the sacred private wreckage of her home. What had felt thrilling and dangerous in the sterile aisles of Greenleaf Market now felt unspeakably cheap. The glamorous illusion of her affair was entirely stripped away, reduced to an annoying, vibrating piece of glass and metal demanding attention. She wanted desperately to lunge forward to snatch the phone and hurl it against the tile floor until the screen is shattered into 1,000 black shards. She wanted to silence the sickening proof of her infidelity. But her feet felt cemented to the floorboards. To step into the light to claim the device would be to physically claim ownership of the betrayal right in front of the man it destroyed. The phone went dark for 10 agonizing seconds. The kitchen plunged back into shadows. Rafael did not move a single muscle. Then the screen flared to life, once more brighter this time. The rhythmic buzzing shifted into a continuous, aggressive drone. An incoming call. Tyler was actually calling her in the middle of the night, brazen and utterly careless about the risk he was taking. The device danced slightly on the polished quartz, the noise filling the room like a siren. Rafael did not look at the caller ID. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, turning his gaze away from the blinding light of the phone and looked straight into the dark archway of the foyer. His eyes locked flawlessly onto the exact shadow where Carmen was hiding. He knew she was there. He had known the entire time, and he was going to make her listen to it ring. The phone finally stopped ringing. The missed call notification glowed like a radioactive warning on the screen for a few seconds before the display clicked off, plunging the kitchen back into complete darkness. The silence that followed was worse than the mechanical buzzing. It was a suffocating vacuum that demanded to be filled. Carmen could not hold out any longer. The psychological pressure cracked her chest wide open. She stepped out from the shadows of the foyer, the hardwood floor creaking beneath her bare feet. "Raf," she choked out. The word tore at her throat. She moved into the dim light spilling from the hallway, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. Tears spilled freely down her face, hot and humiliating. "Please, please, say something, anything." Rafael did not turn his head. He remained perfectly still on the bar stool, a dark silhouette against the faint ambient glow of the storm outside. I don't know how it happened, Carmen babbled, the dam breaking. She took a hesitant step closer, her voice thick with desperation. It wasn't, it didn't mean anything, Raf. I swear to God. You were just, you were working so much. I felt so invisible. It was just a stupid, terrible mistake. I was confused. I didn't want to hurt you. She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to scream, to call her names, to hurl the bowl of lemons at the wall. If he yelled, she could cry harder. If he showed rage, she could show remorse. That was the script. That was how these things were supposed to work. Instead, Rafael slowly rotated his stool to face her. His expression was not angry. It was terrifyingly analytical. A mistake, Rafael repeated. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through her sobs with the precision of a scalpel. Dropping a wine glass is a mistake, Carmen. Taking the wrong exit on the freeway is a mistake. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Booking a corner suite at the Fairmont on a Tuesday afternoon requires a credit card, a reservation, and a valid ID. It requires you to look Rachel in the eye and lie about inventory. It requires you to come home, kiss me on the cheek, and ask how my day was while the scent of another man's cologne is still in your hair. You did not make a mistake, Carmen. You made hundreds of tiny, deliberate choices, every single day for 3 months. Carmen recoiled as if she had been physically struck. The breath left her lungs. Her pathetic defense, the narrative she had spun to herself about being a neglected wife, seeking a fleeting moment of connection, evaporated under the blinding light of his logic. You weren't confused. Rafael continued, his tone devoid of any inflection. He was simply stating facts. You were bored, and Tyler Black was convenient. He offered you a cheap thrill that didn't require the mundane effort of actually maintaining a marriage. Do not insult my intelligence by dressing up your selfishness as a tragic romance. I love you, she sobbed, sinking to her knees on the cold floor, the fight completely draining out of her. It was a desperate, pathetic plea. Rafael looked down at her, his eyes hollow. No, you don't. You love the comfort I provide. You love this house and the stability and the fact that I make sure the oil in your car is changed. But you do not love me. Because people do not actively conspire to humiliate the people they love. He stood up, towering over her weeping form for a brief, terrible second. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer a shred of pity. He simply turned his back on her and walked back toward the stairs, leaving her alone on the floor to choke on the ashes of the illusions she had built. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a bruised metallic gray bleeding through the rain-streaked windows. The storm had downgraded from a violent gale to a relentless, miserable downpour, trapping them in a cold, damp limbo. Carmen sat alone at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of water. She hadn't slept. She hadn't changed clothes. The house felt like a tomb. The sudden sharp chime of the doorbell shattered the quiet. Carmen flinched, the mug rattling against the mahogany wood. Nobody visited in this weather. Her mind immediately leaped to Tyler. Had his bruised ego actually driven him out into the flood warnings? Panic seized her throat, thick and suffocating. Before she could stand, the floorboards above her creaked. Rafael descended the stairs. He was dressed in a clean dark sweater and jeans, his hair damp from another shower. He looked entirely put together, a jarring contrast to the absolute devastation inside the house. He didn't glance at the dining room. He walked straight to the foyer and pulled open the heavy oak door. Rafael, a woman's voice said, breathless and cautious. It wasn't Tyler. It was Rachel Green. Carmen froze, a new distinct type of nausea rising in her stomach. From her vantage point, she could just see Rachel standing on the covered porch, a thick yellow raincoat dripping onto the welcome mat, clutching a clear plastic folder against her chest. Rachel lived less than 2 miles away, clearly having navigated the debris-strewn suburban roads in her SUV. Rachel, Rafael replied. His voice was smooth, flawlessly polite, and entirely empty. Come in out of the rain. Rachel stepped into the entryway, the smell of wet asphalt and damp wool following her inside. I'm sorry to intrude, Raf. The store is operating on a skeleton crew today because of the road closures. Carmen left the fourth quarter vendor contracts on her desk, and I thought I should bring them by. It was a lie, a flimsy, transparent excuse. Rachel had seen the frantic, unanswered texts from Tyler lighting up the management and group chats that morning. She had felt the toxic tension brewing for months, and her sharp instincts had driven her to check on the inevitable collision. Rachel's dark, perceptive eyes scanned the foyer. They landed instantly on Rafael's packed duffel bag still sitting by the console table where he had dropped it last night. Then she looked up at Rafael's face. She saw the rigid set of his jaw, the chilling absence of the warm, welcoming husband she had shared drinks with at corporate holiday parties. A silent, heavy conversation passed between them in the span of 3 seconds. Rachel knew about Tyler, and looking into the absolute void of Rafael's eyes, she realized instantly that he knew everything. "She's in the dining room," Rafael said quietly. He did not step aside to guide her in. He just stared at Rachel, his gaze pinning her to the floorboards. "Thank you for bringing the files, Rachel, and thank you for keeping such a close eye on my wife lately. Your discretion over the past few months has been remarkable." The words were softly spoken, but they struck like a physical blow. Rachel swallowed hard, her professional composure cracking. The subtle complicity of her silence at Greenleaf Market was suddenly dragged into the light, exposed under the harsh reality of a ruined marriage. Rachel stepped hesitantly toward the archway, clutching the plastic folder like a shield. Carmen remained glued to her chair, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. The glamorous, confident department manager was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell sitting in the ruins of her own life. "I'll just leave these here," Rachel whispered, placing the files on the edge of the nearest table, keeping her distance. She didn't offer a word of comfort. There was no comfort to give. She simply turned and walked back out into the rain, leaving Carmen to choke on the unbearable reality that her two worlds had finally devastatingly collided. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Rachel Green, sealing the house once more against the relentless Seattle rain. Rafael stood in the foyer for a brief moment, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the only sound bridging the gap between them. He did not return to the upstairs bedroom. Instead, he walked past the dining room archway, his footsteps steady and deliberate, disappearing down the hall toward his home office. Carmen remained frozen at the dining table. The water in her mug had gone completely cold. She stared at the empty space Rachel had just occupied, the suffocating weight of public shame pressing down on her chest. She foolishly hoped Rafael would retreat, giving her a moment to process the wreckage. 2 minutes later, he returned. He was carrying a thick, unmarked manila folder. He stepped into the dining room and stopped opposite her, the expanse of the polished mahogany table stretching between them like a barren battlefield. He did not look at her face. He looked only at the wood. Slowly, methodically, Rafael unspooled the string securing the folder. He reached inside. The first item he withdrew was a crisp, white piece of paper. He placed it carefully on the table and slid it across the mahogany surface until it stopped inches from Carmen's hands. It was a printed credit card statement, a card she didn't know he had access to. A bright yellow highlighter marked 3 separate charges to the Fairmont Hotel dating back to October. Carmen's breath hitched a sharp gasp, tearing through her throat. October. That was over 3 months ago. Rafael reached into the folder again. He pulled out a small navy blue velvet box. He didn't open it. He simply set it down next to the statement with a soft, dull thud. Carmen recognized it instantly. It was the pair of sapphire drop earrings Tyler had given her for her birthday in November. She had worn them to Thanksgiving dinner, looking Rafael dead in the eye and telling him she had treated herself at Nordstrom with her holiday bonus. Next came the printed toll pass records documenting her sedan crossing the SR 520 bridge toward Tyler's downtown condo on afternoons she had sworn she was doing inventory. Then a parking citation from a street 2 blocks from the hotel. With each item Rafael laid on the table, the air in the room grew thinner. The sound of paper brushing against wood was deafening. He was performing an autopsy on their marriage, removing the diseased organs one by one and displaying them under the harsh, unforgiving light of the dining room chandelier. The sheer terror did not stem from the items themselves. The terror was the realization of his patience. For over 90 days, Rafael had known. He had watched her dress up for another man. He had listened to her fabricate elaborate lies about late shifts and sick friends. He had sat across from her at this very table, eating the dinner she cooked, asking about her day, kissing her forehead before they went to sleep, while holding this toxic, devastating knowledge. He had not been blind. He had been a silent, meticulous investigator, enduring the daily humiliation of her deceit, while quietly severing his emotional ties to her thread by thread. Rafael emptied the final item, a printed screenshot of a singular blurry photograph he had taken of Tyler's Porsche parked at Greenleaf Market, time-stamped from a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He placed the empty folder down. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time since Rachel left. There was no rage in his expression. There was only a terrifying, hollow finality. He had laid out the architecture of her ruin, proving that her carefully constructed lies had never been a secret. They had only been a performance delivered to an audience that already held the script. The artifacts of betrayal lay untouched on the mahogany table. Carmen couldn't pull her gaze away from the blurry photograph of the black Porsche. Then the low, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine cut through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Headlights swept violently across the frosted glass of the dining room window, casting long, erratic shadows against the pale walls. A car door slammed with a heavy metallic thud. Heavy footsteps marched swiftly up the concrete walkway. Not a doorbell this time. A fist pounded aggressively against the oak. Carmen. The voice was muffled by the thick wood and the howling wind, but the arrogant, impatient cadence was unmistakable. Tyler Black had come to collect. Carmen's blood turned to ice. She scrambled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. She wanted to scream at him, to run, to hide the evidence, to rewind the clock back to yesterday. Tyler was supposed to exist only in the sterile aisles of Greenleaf Market or the anonymous luxury of a hotel suite. His physical presence on her front porch was a vulgar, catastrophic violation of the fragile boundary she thought she controlled. Rafael did not flinch at the pounding. He slowly lifted his gaze from the evidence on the table and looked toward the foyer. His expression remained utterly unreadable. No surprise, no outrage. It was as if he had factored this exact variable into his meticulous equation. He turned his back to Carmen and walked steadily down the hall. The pounding resumed, louder and more demanding. "Carmen, open the door. I know you're in there. Your car is in the drive." Rafael gripped the brass handle, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy door open. The wind immediately whipped into the entryway, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and wet asphalt. Tyler stood on the threshold, his expensive dark Italian wool coat speckled with rain, his jaw set in a tight line of extreme irritation. He had clearly prepared a speech, a calculated mix of anger at her silence and arrogant charm meant to bend her back to his will. But the words died instantly in his throat. Tyler stepped back instinctively, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the slick, wet porch. The towering, intimidating regional director suddenly looked distinctly out of place, a trespasser caught entirely off guard in the harsh glare of the porch light. Rafael stood perfectly still in the doorframe, filling the space. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He simply looked at Tyler with the same clinical, terrifying detachment he had used to dismantle his wife an hour earlier. "She is not available to take your calls, Tyler," Rafael said. The absolute calmness in his voice was infinitely more dangerous than a scream. Tyler swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically past Rafael's shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the interior shadows. The corporate swagger vanished, replaced by the rapid, shallow breathing of a man who realized he had walked blindfolded into a minefield. I was just in the neighborhood," Tyler stammered the lie, sounding pathetic and hollow over the roar of the storm. "I needed to speak to Carmen about the inventory logs. It's a regional emergency." Rafael tilted his head just a fraction of an inch, his eyes cold and devoid of any human warmth. "The only emergency here, Tyler, is the fact that you drove 30 miles in a flood, warning for a woman who has already cost you more than you can afford." Rafael took half a step back, opening the door wider. The gesture felt exactly like a trap springing loose. "Step inside." Tyler hesitated, the driving rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. Driven by a toxic mixture of bruised ego and sheer disbelief, he stepped over the threshold. Water dripped from his expensive wool coat, joining the puddle Rafael had left on the Persian runner hours earlier. Rafael closed the heavy oak door. The violent roar of the storm was instantly muffled, sealing the three of them inside the suffocating, dimly lit foyer. "Carmen, Rafael called out, his voice smooth and devoid of any fluctuation. "Come here." Carmen forced her trembling legs to move, stepping out from the shadows of the dining room archway. Her eyes immediately sought Tyler. She desperately needed to see the powerful, commanding man who had whispered intoxicating promises against her skin in the quiet corners of Greenleaf Market. She needed a lifeline. But the man standing in her hallway did not look powerful. Stripped of his corporate authority and cornered by a husband who refused to play the part of the hysterical victim, Tyler looked like a cornered animal. His eyes darted nervously past Carmen, landing briefly on the dining table where the manila folder and the velvet jewelry box sat like unexploded ordnance. "You're a man of decisive action, Tyler," Rafael said, breaking the heavy silence. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke as if he were discussing a quarterly logistics report. "You saw something you wanted and you took it. So I am removing the obstacles. My lawyer will file the papers on Monday. I will be freezing our joint accounts tomorrow morning. She is all yours." Rafael gestured loosely toward Carmen. "Take her. Take the woman you love. She can ride out the storm in your condo, or you can book the corner suite at the Fairmont. But she is leaving this house with you tonight." Carmen's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at Tyler, waiting for him to step forward to wrap his arms around her, to declare that he would take care of her, just as he had promised in the dark. Tyler's face drained of color. He took a distinct, undeniable step backward toward the door. "Look, Rafael," Tyler began, his voice dropping into a placating, negotiated tone that made Carmen's stomach heave. "Let's be reasonable. This got completely out of hand. It was a lapse in judgment. But I can't just take her. I have my position at the company. I have a reputation. If this gets out the board of directors," he couldn't even finish the sentence. He couldn't even look Carmen in the eye. "Tyler," Carmen whispered the word, fracturing in her throat. The grand cinematic romance she had sacrificed her entire life for was dissolving right in front of her. "Carmen, please," Tyler snapped, a flash of genuine irritation breaking through his panic. Tell him it was just a fling. We were just blowing off steam. I never promised you anything permanent." The words struck Carmen with the force of a physical blow. A fling, blowing off steam. She stared at the man she had risked her soul for, finally seeing him not through the lens of illicit desire, but under the harsh, unforgiving light of consequence. He was a coward, a profoundly selfish, empty man who viewed her as nothing more than an expendable convenience. Rafael stood perfectly still, watching the illusion shatter in his wife's eyes. He had not laid a hand on Tyler. He hadn't needed to. He had simply handed Tyler the bill for his actions and watched the man refuse to pay. "There is your choice, Carmen," Rafael said quietly, delivering the final fatal blow to her reality. "Beg the man who just called you a mistake to take you with him, or stay here and pack your bags alone." Tyler Black did not look at Carmen again. The heavy, suffocating silence in the foyer pressed against him, exposing the hollow core beneath his tailored Italian wool and corporate arrogance. He was a man who only played games he knew he could win, and looking at the cold, unyielding architecture of Rafael's face, Tyler realized he had already lost everything he valued. He reached for the brass handle of the front door, his hand trembling slightly. The sleek, powerful regional director was reduced to a frantic trespasser, fumbling with a lock, desperate to escape the consequences of his own ego. "I have to go," Tyler muttered to the floorboards. It was a pathetic, empty dismissal. He didn't offer an apology to Rafael, nor a word of comfort to the woman he had claimed to adore just 24 hours earlier. He simply pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped backward into the freezing air. The violent gale of the Pacific storm had finally broken. The howling wind that had rattled the window panes all night had died down, replaced by a steady, dismal drizzle. The sky above the Seattle suburbs was shifting into a bruised pale gray as the morning light struggled to pierce the heavy cloud cover. The door clicked shut, severing Tyler from their lives with a dull, sickening finality. Through the frosted glass side panels of the entryway, Carmen watched the distorted, blurred shape of the man she had destroyed her life for. She heard the heavy metallic slam of the Porsche door. A second later, the high-performance engine roared to life, violently cutting through the quiet morning. The tires spun briefly, screeching against the wet asphalt as they fought for traction before the car shot down the suburban street. Within moments, the sound of the engine faded entirely, swallowed by the damp, quiet neighborhood. He was gone. He had run. Carmen sank slowly to the floor, her knees buckling beneath her. The cold hardwood bit into her skin, but she barely felt it. She was entirely numb. The intoxicating fantasy she had built, the stolen afternoons. The secret text, the illusion of being desired by a powerful man, had vaporized, leaving nothing behind but ash. Tyler had not fought for her. He had not even hesitated. When faced with the reality of her husband, Tyler had discarded her with the same casual indifference one uses to throw away a crumpled receipt. She sat in the foyer, her back slumped against the wall, staring blankly at the empty space where her lover had just stood. From the dining room, the faint yellow glow of the chandelier still illuminated the manila folder, the credit card statement, and the velvet jewelry box, the artifacts of her ruin. Rafael remained standing a few feet away. He had watched the entire scene unfold with the same detached clinical precision he had maintained all night. There was no triumphant smirk on his face. There was no vindication in his dark eyes. He looked infinitely tired, a man who had successfully excised a tumor, but was now left to deal with the permanent aching scar. He looked down at his wife, huddled and shivering on the floor. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer his coat. The time for protection had passed. Without a single word, Rafael turned away from the front door. He walked past her, his footsteps heavy and measured, and began ascending the staircase to finish packing the rest of his life. The house, stripped of its secrets and its illusions, fell into a profound, terrifying silence. The morning air was crisp and biting, the kind of cold that followed a Pacific storm and stripped the world of its haze. Through the open window of the guest room, the scent of wet pine and clean pavement drifted in, mocking the stagnant, heavy atmosphere inside the house. Rafael moved with a quiet, efficient rhythm. He didn't rush. He folded his remaining shirts and placed his watch collection into a padded leather case. Each item he tucked into a suitcase felt like a stitch being pulled from the fabric of his 7-year marriage. He didn't look for mementos. He didn't pause over the framed photograph on the dresser of them laughing on a pier in Maine. He simply closed the lid of his suitcase and pulled the zipper shut. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, Carmen was still there. She had moved from the floor to the bottom step of the staircase, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes were hollowed out by a night of grief and self-inflicted ruin. She looked at him with a desperate, flickering hope that the coming of dawn might have softened his resolve. "Raf," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where will you go?" Rafael stopped at the foot of the stairs, his suitcase handle gripped firmly in his hand. He looked at her, but he didn't really see her, not as the woman he had loved, but as a stranger he had finally finished studying. "Away from here," he replied. His voice was steady, lacking the sharp edge of the previous night's anger. It was worse. It was indifferent. "The house will be listed by the end of the month. You'll have enough from your share to find an apartment closer to the market." Is there any chance?" Carmen's voice broke. "Can we just talk? Not like last night. Can we try to understand?" "I understand everything I need to, Carmen," Rafael interrupted softly. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag. "You trade things. You traded our history for a few hours in a hotel. You traded my trust for a man who wouldn't even hold the door open for you when things got difficult. I'm just finishing the transaction." He walked toward the front door. He didn't look back at the dining room table, where the sapphire earrings and the hotel receipts still sat like gravestones. He didn't look at the kitchen, where they had shared 1,000 quiet breakfasts. He opened the door. The Seattle sky was a pale, mocking blue, the clouds scattered and thin. "I'm sorry, Rafael," she cried out, the words finally spilling out in a frantic, useless rush. "I am so sorry." Rafael paused on the threshold, the morning light silhouetting his frame. He didn't turn around. "I know you are," he said quietly, "but you're only sorry because you're the one left in the wreckage. If Tyler had taken you with him, you wouldn't be thinking of me at all." He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him. The click of the latch was the final period at the end of their story. Carmen sat on the stairs, listening to the sound of his footsteps on the driveway. She heard the trunk of his car slam. She heard the engine start, a low, steady hum that lacked the aggressive roar of Tyler's Porsche. She listened as the sound moved further and further away, turning the corner at the end of the block, until it was replaced by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. The storm was over. The sky was clear, and for the first time in her life, Carmen Delgado understood the true meaning of silence. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the weight of a house that would never again hold a heart beside her own. She sat in the pale morning light, a woman who had sought a thrill and found only the cold, permanent reality of being alone.